Hi everyone, welcome. We'll give it a minute to let everyone in from the waiting room. Feel free to introduce yourselves and where you're from in the chat. Welcome everyone, we'll give it one more minute. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Looks like we have people calling in from all over the country, coming in a little bit too fast for me to keep up with. So glad to have you all here. And I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC. I'm really excited to welcome you all to what I think is the 10th webinar in the Our Homes, Our Votes 2022 webinar series, Voter Education, the how, what, when, where, and I totally messed up the order of all of those questions, but we're going to cover all of those today. So just a reminder, as always, that this webinar is being recorded. We will send out the resources and recording and all of the links and slides to you afterwards. So you'll get all of those resources in your inbox. And I'm really excited. We'll have 3 all-star panelists today. Kristen Langworthy from the Housing Network of Rhode Island, Santra Denis from the Miami Workers Center, and Owen Hutchinson from the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness to present on each of their voter engagement efforts. And we'll have time to ask questions of each of our panelists, so be sure to use the chat box all throughout the session. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kristen to get us started.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Langworthy. I'm the Community Engagement and Government Relations Coordinator at the Housing Network of Rhode Island. I'm so excited to be here with you all today and want to thank you for joining in the efforts to engage our communities and make sure everyone is ready to vote. I'm going to walk through a little bit of what we're doing for folks in Rhode Island, and we're going to cover the kind of the who, what, when, where, why, and how to prepare our voters to be fully engaged and ready for our elections. I'm going to share my screen and walk you through some of the resources that we've developed and some of the tools that we've partnered on developing with our Secretary of State's office as well. And just, if I could get the permissions to share, that would be great. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're at the Housing Network, we have a policy advocacy working group called Homes RI that really powers our community engagement work. And we've built out on our website a housing voter action page. We've started with giving people a landing space to get access to information that are in our network. And so we've put all of our voter engagement information and tools front and center on their own page. And it kind of outlines why folks should be housing voters, why voting, if an issue like housing is important to you, why it's important to be a voter. We've outlined key dates, and that's really one of the most important things that we can make sure voters are aware of is what are the dates and deadlines, which will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Every state sets its own rules. And so making sure people know when deadlines like registration, applications for mail ballots, early voting periods, if you have early voting, and when election day is right in front and center. it's really important that people engage in both primary elections and general elections. State and local races are incredibly important, and the housing issue crosses all levels of government, from the municipal all the way up to the federal. And so we want people to know the information both about the primary elections and the general election. Rhode Island has its primary coming up in September, and so we're getting ready. We also have fleshed out a community calendar. Folks can send us or submit to us through a link on this page any activities or events that they're doing in our different organizations that we're partnering with. There's candidate forums, community conversations, debates and Q&As, all sorts of events that are coming up, like festivals and cultural events. And it helps people connect and think of opportunities to integrate some of these tools and information into the outreach and community work that they're already doing. But also it's a great resource for voters who are looking for opportunities to connect with candidates and learn more about the issues and where they are standing on them through the calendar. This also has been preloaded with all of those important dates that are right here above on a Google Calendar style that allows someone to just click and add all of those dates to their own Google Calendar as well. So it's a really nifty little shortcut. And we have our steps to get vote ready kind of laid out really simply. And we've hyperlinked to our state specific resources. So step one is registration. Folks need to know what the registration deadline is and the conditions for registration, which may vary from one place to another. For example, Rhode Island is an automatic voter registration state. So we have a process through the DMV that allows people to be registered, right? Any interaction they have with the DMV, and it captures a lot of folks. But if they move or they change their name or they want to change their party affiliation, they need to know that those are things that will cause them to need to update their voter registration information. And making sure people know where and how to do that is really important, especially for young people or people who have not voted before or are not frequent voters. You want to ask things like, when's the last time you updated your voter registration, or have you moved since the last time you voted? If you're a state like ours that allows 16-year-olds and up to pre-register, that's a really important thing to note. But also, Rhode Island passed voter rights restoration for folks who are formerly incarcerated as well, which means they automatically have their registration reinstated when they leave incarceration, but they're going to need to update it if it's a place that they're living that they didn't live before. So this is a good part about getting people ready. You also want to connect people to options to register online or forms that may need to be downloaded and printed. So that's an important consideration. If your state doesn't provide an online registration option, then a paper form and the process for processing those applications for registration is really meaningful here. Step two for preparation is planning your vote. And that's a really important part of this process, making sure that people know what options are available to them in their jurisdiction and how to utilize them step by step. In simple language is an important way to support voters making a plan. And when we make a plan, we're more likely to successfully cast our ballot. And so this is a really helpful, meaningful step to make sure that we're understanding our options. So we've put in a little mini video telling people what their options are in Rhode Island. And then we've kind of broken down those options with deadlines, links to the application for mail ballot forms, an infographic that walks people through the steps of voting by mail, for example, something that many people had not done before 2020, but it has become increasingly popular. And I think it's a great option for folks who are busy working or taking care of their families, or who prefer to sit at home and take a second to really look at their ballot and not feel the crush and rush of that election day polling place. It's a secure option that many people enjoyed during the last election. And I think it's a great way to support more people participating in our elections that might not otherwise have time or access on election day, especially if you don't have access to transportation or time off. Then we have early in-person voting in Rhode Island. So if you do have an early voting process, knowing when those periods are open and how to participate. For example, you will need voter ID in our state. So having an idea of what kinds of photo ID is valid and where the polling locations or early voting locations are going to be and what hours they're going to be. Those are key information that people need. And then there's voting in person on election day, voting classic. And again, people want to make sure that they know where their polling place is and that they're checking their polling place hours and that they have their ID if necessary as well. Those are the three options that we have here in Rhode Island. We also really want to emphasize that for folks who are going to the polls this year after the redistricting process has been completed, it's really meaningful to encourage people to check where their polling place is and where they're going to be voting from, because many of those things have changed. Step 3 is getting informed. Voters want to feel confident and informed. I think a lot of folks probably have had this experience when they're talking to people and encouraging them to get to voting as a way to build power for the community. And I often hear the feedback, I don't feel like I know enough about what's on my ballot, who the candidates are, or the issues. And that kind of intimidation can make people feel like not participating or that they shouldn't participate. And we want to make sure that people feel confident that they have the information that they need. We can't know what's important to any given individual. Only they can really know what matters most to them. But we had some key supportive steps to help folks feel more informed. One is we created a pledge to be a housing voter, to create an option for people to receive messages about housing issues and reminders of the election deadlines and resources that would help them plan their vote. We're also building out a candidate questionnaire and looking to publish those responses about different housing issues as on our voter resources page. But we also are connecting people to where they can view their sample ballot on our state's voter information center. And as we go forward, we are collecting clips from local debates, forums, and other spotlights of candidate conversations. And we're going to have them available for folks to look at. And it's going to be housing focused, but they'll also have links to the full recordings when available. So forums like on climate or working issues for labor have intersections with housing, and yet they're also issues that affect voters in other ways. So feeling more robustly informed as a whole. And then step 4 is knowing your rights. We really want to make sure that people are aware of their rights. When we know our rights, we can speak up for ourselves and others. So we have outlined resources on voting while experiencing homelessness and resources to connect to in the state to make sure that folks without a permanent address are able to cast their ballot. Knowledge about a provisional ballot, which no one should be turned away from the polls on election day. In Rhode Island, you have the right to request a provisional ballot if you're qualified, registered voter, and you go to the polls and your name isn't on the list or you forgot your ID at home. It's really important that folks know they have the right to ask for a provisional ballot, and that after their eligibility has been verified, they'll be able to count that ballot. People are supposed to be free of harassment and intimidation. And so we outline, the state law that is applicable there, what is and is not allowed at a polling place, for example, and what kind of assistance people can request. In our state, anyone can choose to bring a person of their preference into the voting booth if they need assistance. But we also make bipartisan pairs of poll workers available to support voters in person on election day. We also have an address confidentiality program for survivors of domestic violence who have a court order, protective order. And that's an important resource to make people aware of In Rhode Island, when you register to vote, all your information on your registration form, except for your social security number, so to speak, is made public information. And so if we're being mindful about the concerns and considerations for folks who may not be safe, when we think about those kinds of barriers, we want to make sure that people know there are bridges to get them past that barrier, to protect their address, and make sure that that's not the factor that keeps them from voting, and that they're empowered to make their voices heard. Same as folks who are formerly incarcerated. If you're in a state where people who are formerly incarcerated are eligible to vote, you want to make sure that you are making the information available to people in that affected community, and in the community of folks around them. That is really important because in Rhode Island, for example, if you're incarcerated, but not on a felony conviction, you still have the right to vote, and that would need to be done by mail because you cannot leave in order to vote. So being able to be supported by your community is a really important way. There's such a high intersection with formerly incarcerated people and housing insecurity. So as we have a returning people to the community, we want to make sure that they're supported in reestablishing their civic participation. And then also we have resources for folks who are trying to vote with while transitioning. Identity is not something that gender identity is not something we want to be excluding anyone, but it does present some challenges. So knowing what your options are for ID especially, and what kind of experience you might have when you go to the polls in person, is something we partnered with Health Center in Rhode Island and the Department of State to develop some resources. Those are the main pieces of our housing voter readiness. We've also developed out a vote ready update messaging. Once a week, we send out an update with kind of the key reminders of the week, making sure that those dates that are coming up and the links to the resources, for example, the registration form is what we were doing this past week, and information on disaffiliating. So many voters may not know that the primary election is something that sets up a partisan element in their registration. So if you are a registered Democrat in Rhode Island and you want to vote in a Republican primary, you have to either be unaffiliated or affiliate with the Republicans, and vice versa, in order to participate in their primary election in September. And so that process and deadline is highlighted. We also have information about voting by mail in this update and a little video about that process, because that deadline is coming up for our primary. And then we also have our pledge, our link to our pledge, asking folks to make a commitment to be a voter in the upcoming elections. And that pledge will also send them key reminders and deadlines. We've developed out the community calendar, as I said, so this is what that looks like. And this is our pledge. We're using Action Network so that we can collect the information from people who are taking the pledge, and we're going to utilize that information to continue our GOTV efforts and outreach. We also plan to utilize that in our future advocacy for housing at the State House and other levels of government. But we talk a little bit about why it's important to be a voter for housing, and ask people a few key questions along with their contact information, their housing status, whether they're registered, and what way they plan to vote in the upcoming election cycle, and give them an option to share a story about their own experience that helps us understand why they are motivated to be a housing voter. And then they pledge, and they can share this with friends through social media as well. This infographic is a resource that we developed in partnership with our Secretary of State's office. It's kind of the one-stop shop. It's really great. You make your plan kind of outline, and these are hyperlinked to the key elements of the Voter Information Center. That's official information from the state. So you have your dates and deadlines, your prompt to check your registration. In Rhode Island, you have to be registered at least 30 days before Election Day. And so that varies from state to state. So making sure people know how far in advance they have to be registered is really important. Previewing a sample ballot is a really helpful way for people to know who and what they might be voting on and to get prepared ahead of time. And then knowing how to use the options that are available to them to cast their ballot. And that's a really great thing to share because it's all in one and helpful for folks to pass along because it's not very complicated either. We've actually developed the other half of that process for our voters that we're trying to engage, which is a checklist, has all the key dates and deadlines here, and a checklist. I've taken my pledge, I've registered to vote at my current address, I've chosen my method of voting, I've researched what is on my ballot, and I've nudged 3 friends to vote too, and I'm sharing on social media that I am vote ready. And if you're voting by mail, there's a checklist for the process, and if you're voting in person, there's a checklist for that process. Thinking about things like what day and time am I going to be voting at, where my polling place is, finding that location and identifying it, confirming that I have my proper photo ID and that I've planned my transportation. Those are the resources that we're in part sharing through our email and social media process and with our partners that we're working with in different organizations. This is what our state's voter information center looks like. And as you can see, there are really easy widgets to click through on the different pieces to get people prepared. It's really helpful to make sure you're sharing state-specific information and official sources of information as often as possible to link directly to the state official sources of information for voters. To also talk about the why it's important to vote, how decisions are made in a democratic process, and what representative democracy really looks like when voices aren't being heard. You got to contrast it against what the potential is. Reaching people who have not been voting as consistently or have never voted before sometimes means going back to the basics and making sure people understand what democratic participation is about, what the levels of government are and their responsibility to their constituents. This resource gives an infographic with different issues plotted out on the local, state, and federal level, and other resources that help people understand the context of elections. We've developed out some, or excuse me, our Secretary of State's office has developed out some great printed materials as well, posters that can be printed and put in person with key deadlines and links that will help people go where they need to be, but also QR codes are a really helpful tool to make sure that you can connect to that information in multiple ways. Some people really need that printed option because they don't have a printer at home or internet connection, or if you're not stably housed, you may not have access to that information as you need. But public libraries and other community organizations that create space for folks, that's a great place to have these kinds of printed materials and a computer or a iPad available for folks to engage that may not have the technology or internet support access at home. The ways to vote is also a really important thing. I think a lot of states are changing election laws, so being mindful of that flux and making sure people know that maybe something has changed from the way it was before. In a lot of states, we've seen a rollback on voting rights and voter access, but in Rhode Island, our team was part of a campaign with over 40 organizations to change the election laws in a positive direction and make it sure that folks had more access in future elections based on our experiences in 2020. And photo ID is something that is going to be also jurisdiction specific. So making sure that people are prepared with what type of ID is required and the ways that they have to present it. For example, in Rhode Island, we've recently established driving privilege cards for undocumented folks, but that's not an acceptable form of ID because you need to be a US citizen in order to vote in our elections. So we also make sure that folks who don't have a photo ID, for example, many people do not drive. If you don't have a valid form of photo ID, we have a free ID program in our state and a way to connect with our elections administrators to make sure that folks have that is an important resource. Finding your polling place, especially as things have changed, is really important. So this is a way to look up where your polling place will be or your sample ballot and know your election hours. When you're voting in person, knowing how to use the election equipment itself to mark your ballot. We all use different machines. Some are similar to others. We have two forms of ballot marking machines now in Rhode Island. The Express Vote is the newest. It has many accessibility features, which are important for folks to know so that they can vote in the way that's most comfortable for them. So we have the paper marking, fill in the ovals with a pen, or the Express Vote, which you have a touch screen and then it prints out the vote on a card, and that's your ballot, and you put it into the machine to be counted. But basically knowing how to do those things and breaking it down with some visual aids. And then also mail ballots take time to send and receive. So folks should know when those deadlines are, but also to make sure that they are mailing them ahead early enough. And if they don't, to be received and counted. And if they don't have a way to to return by mail, drop boxes are becoming more and more common. And so we also have a drop box system that we've implemented recently. Breaking down how to fill out a form, how to fill out the mail ballot application form in particular is helpful to identify what parts of the form you need to respond to, and especially the signature line. The conditions for applying for a mail ballot are different for different states. In Rhode Island, you no longer need a particular reason or special circumstance to apply, but that's not true for everybody. So knowing what qualifications for an application to a mail ballot is important, and then how to return them as well. Not everybody has access to drop boxes. There may be certain conditions for returning by mail or even voting by mail. So knowing how and where and what to do if there's a mistake when marking your ballot is also really important. Our state's developed a Dropbox locator system. So you can put in an address, and we have universal recipient drop boxes, one in each of the 39 cities and towns in our tiny little state. You put in your address and you can find the one that's closest to you. So if you're working in one area and you live in another, you don't have to go home to drop your ballot off. But as I was saying before, election laws vary. So you want to know what the rules are for who can return a mail ballot for somebody, and how to utilize the drop boxes if you have them available. Most of organizations that don't do election work as a regular part of their day-to-day activities might need a little bit of a lift. So information on how to engage your community. Hopefully we'll have language access to the different communities that are making up your state. And these are some guides that we have developed with animations and social media tools and sample language in the communication guide, so that people can know what kinds of emails or social media messages are helpful to send and at what times. I think I've gone probably over my time by a bit, but there are some other things that videos are really helpful to make sure that people know how things may look and sound, but also it's easily shared. So we have some videos on the different pieces, how to register, how to use the machines. And I think that is the summary of what I think is helpful to know, except candidates. It is really hard for folks to know who's running and how to get information about them. That's one of the number one things I've been asked in our outreach so far is, where can I find out information about candidates? So that is something you might want to be prepared to have some information about, and keeping it nonpartisan, just having information about where you can find who's on your ballot. Like, this is where we would look for who is running for different offices. But that is also kind of complicated for people to navigate. So trying to simplify that process is really helpful. We also did a train the trainer session with our Secretary of State's office on some of these resources. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and thank you all for being patient as I walked through everybody or everything.
Thank you so much, Kristen. This is just a really incredible set of resources. Definitely send me all of these links and I'll make sure they get in the follow-up email. I'm going to pass it over to Santra now.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and view a slideshow and make sure that if y'all see me looking off to the sides, because I have a double screen going. I'm excited to introduce the work that we're doing at the Miami Worker Center. We're based in Miami, Florida. Santra Denis, I'm the executive director of the Miami Worker Center. So a little bit about the Miami Worker Center. We not only organize tenants, we also organize domestic workers, people who work as home health aides, nannies, house cleaners, which make up a large component of our economy here in Miami-Dade County. Again, specific to the work that we're doing in coalition with many of you all is around issue-based voter education. And so we are connecting or doing work at the intersection of housing and government power or electoral power. Let me go to the next slide. We think it's really important when engaging our residents to really name what folks are actually experiencing in the present moment. Far too often, when people are engaging in election time, they are asked to engage. It can seem as if the work that folks are doing, or even the candidates, are tone deaf and not necessarily speaking as much to current crises or current issue areas that people want specific solutions on. And so we're naming the issue, and we're also naming who has the power to move on specific issues. So we know a housing cost spike, voters look for hope in rent control. Rent control, we don't have that in Florida, for sure, very controversial in Florida, but wanted to name that we are in wanting to position renters in Florida, specifically in Miami, as a strong Florida bloc. Miami currently leads the nation in rent cost burden. And so the Secretary of HUD was just here saying that we're the epicenter on the housing crisis. And so we want community members to know that they're not on their own. The biggest thing that is coming up for them in terms of housing affordability, in terms of conditions issues, is something that we can connect directly to local elections that's happening in August and then again in November. So a little bit more about the crisis in terms of when we're on the doors, or how we're cutting our turf, or how we're creating our universe. We're definitely trying to meet and reach folks who are the most impacted. And for us, that's folks with, for sure, we're connecting with single mothers, mothers of color. You definitely can't cut around immigrant workers, but for sure, we're targeting in what our base is a majority women of color base at the Miami Worker Center. A little bit more about the crisis, and we spend a lot of time here because often people don't believe that, or they're told by local government that there's nothing that can do, that actually the power resides in another office or another position at the state level. And so we're honing in on the issue that is at hand, that is the priority for folks in Florida or South Florida. Currently, it's conditions issues, it's affordability, it's access to public housing, and actually what can local elected officials, what can they do about that? And so we have here the mayor of Miami-Dade County, who in Miami-Dade County, we have a strong mayor, and she is the person who actually has a lot of power to declare a housing state of emergencies. With her declaring that additional powers, there's additional legislation or additional policies that come with that declaration. And so we're positioning, again, through our electoral program, for people to be really clear. While the mayor is not up for election, 6 of our county commissioners are up and turned out, and there will be 6 new county commissioners in Miami-Dade County this year. And why that's important for us to name is because we want the questions that are being posed to those new people to be specific to what are they going to do about conditions issues as it relates to housing? What are they going to do about the rising cost of housing in Miami-Dade County? And we want it to be very specific in terms of their proposed solutions. And so that will be, I'm back on this slide because we think that is our, where we're narrowing in at, because we believe, similar to many of you all, is we're talking about if we can get people to focus in on issues, and we're talking about our community residents, to focus in on the issues that matter to them, they are more inclined to vote. They're more inclined to respond to the messages around tell their friends. They're more inclined to remember when the elections are happening. It's when it's not necessarily related to what their experiences is where we see the most apathy. So specific to our field program in terms of what we're doing, our goal is to target a specific municipality where we believe that there can be a declaration of a housing state of emergency, what allows for, again, us to do a ballot measure around some kind of rent stabilization. For us, we are doing political education with our members, specific to who can do what roles can move certain things forward, specifically because Miami-Dade County is a supermajority minority county. So many folks are coming to the country and not necessarily as aware as how the government works here, what roles do specific people have, and what powers do those roles have. For sure, we make sure that people are clear and understand the key dates, changes in districts. There was a question in the chat box about that. For sure, we want to do a ballot review so people are clear on what is actually on their ballot, and we want them to tell their friends. We've also invited our members to ensure that they're at candidate forums, asking specific questions around declaring a state of housing, a housing state of emergency, or questions specific to conditions issues that they may be experiencing, or affordable housing issues that they might be experiencing. And our tactics are, for sure, door-to-door canvassing. We're doing some phone banking, text banking. Ads on radios is really key for many of our non-English speaking communities, because the radio continues to be their most, what they use the most in terms of their information. And then for sure, some pledge cards. This slide should have been moved up a little bit earlier, but these are the folks who are turned out, and there's elections right now in August for these 6 districts. Eileen Higgins, who's the current commissioner, she's up in 2024. And so again, there's an opportunity for us to ensure that we are clear on the position people have on housing and how to vote based on the issues that are our priorities. I would be remiss as an organizer if we didn't share kind of like some storytelling as it relates to getting persuading people to step up and vote, specifically because in Miami, sometimes people feel as if it's just one group of people or certain types of people who are experiencing housing instability, but we've seen our ability to connect neighborhood to neighborhood, communities to communities, nationalities to nationalities, really positioning, again, a renter block that's really experiencing so much. How can they come together and, again, ensure that folks are voting for elected officials who believe housing is a human right and not a commodity? And so these are rent tenants in North Miami who, after the building collapsed in Surfside, there was a slew of inspections that needed to be done. Their building behind, in the picture on the left, was condemned, and they were not offered first class and security in this housing market right now. And they came together and they organized to ensure that they could get some help with relocation. And so some of the questions in the forum that could be posed, it's again trying to ensure that commissioners understand, communities understand commissioners' points of view in terms of housing is what it should landlords be responsible for relocation fees for a building that is condemned. The same happened in Overtown. This building here was actually sold, and they were given less than a month to relocate. And so again, in the case that people need to relocate, What is commissioners? What are our elected officials? What is their responsibility to the communities that they represent? And the question is posed to our members and to the folks that we are organizing with and doing this voter education program with is what kind of commissioners do they want? And because once they listen in on the forums, they can get a sense of where people are. And also really what I left off in terms of education is around campaign financing. And so who is donating to these campaigns? How are we clear on where their donations coming from? And how does that, again, align or not align with what we want our communities or our commissioners to be moving forward in the communities? And this is Sweetwater again. Folks being displaced and not necessarily being offered any kind of opportunities in terms of a time frame for them to be able to look for additional housing, and then the cost that it would take for them to relocate. I'm going to move really quickly because I know there's someone else. Just want to talk about some of the victories, because it also allows for us to tell people, once we're building power, once people are clear on the issue, once we understand who does what in our government, we also can ensure that there's some wins. And for sure, going into the midterms in a place like Florida, we need as many wins locally as we can get. And so that's what we're trying to lift up in terms of building our momentum. And so we want a 60-day, a eviction and utility ban during the early days of the COVID. Miami-Dade County had one of the longest eviction moratoriums. We're proud of that in our local government and what they were able to do. And so again, we know that local government does have power, and that community members should hold them accountable and push them to make sure that they're doing all the things that they can do within their power to keep them housed. We want a fair notice. So initially last year, tenants only had 15-day notices around increase in rent or that they were being evicted. We were able to first win 30 days and then most recently won 60-day notice around increase in rent and increase in whether or not they had to be evicted. And again, all of this, people would ask, how is this connected to our voter program? Is that people need to know that people who can make decisions on these items, on what they're experiencing on the day-to-day, are the people that they're voting for. Lastly, we just recently won a Tenant Bill of Rights. Those are some of the champions at the local office. I'm going to run through what we're actually on the doors talking about right now is an increased voice and protections for tenant and subsidized housings on Section 8. I'm sure in many of your communities as well, there's a lot going around Section 8. The vouchers don't necessarily represent how much it costs to rent anymore. And so that's an issue we're on the doors talking about, having people to go vote, but also ensuring that they are clear on what the issues are. Rental application fees for low-income tenants. People in Miami-Dade County spend upwards of $100, $200 per application as they're trying to rent, just to never receive that money back. And so we're trying to ask communities, do they have an opinion on this? Do they believe their commissioners should have an opinion on this as well? And then lastly, our biggest one, fight for right to counsel, is really what we're on the doors about. Is commissioners this September will be voting on a budget. We would like for them to fund right to counsel in Miami-Dade County, and the commissioners can do it, and the voters should get their commissioners to do it. I'm gonna, we believe we have to organize. I believe this is my last slide. These are some of our members. Tenant Bill of Rights, a right to stay in our neighborhoods. We believe that People United will never be divided. And that's us at the Miami Workers Center. I'm sure we'll take some questions later.
Thank you so much, Santra. I feel like this presentation just kind of sums up why the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign exists, because we can't have the socially just housing policy that we need unless we are mobilized as voters and making those demands and really tying the issues to voting as a way to overcome apathy. So just very grateful for all the work that you're doing. I think we'll move to Owen before taking questions, and then maybe try to do one at the end, but I see you've also answered some of the questions in the Q&A So I would encourage everyone to take a look at the conversation happening there. Thank you so much, and I will pass it to Owen now.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Santra. My name is Owen Hutchinson. I'm with the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. I was born and raised in Juneau, Alaska, which is the unceded territories of Tlingit Ani, and I currently reside in Anchorage, Alaska, which are the unceded territories of the Dena'ina and Lower Athabascan people. It's important for me to acknowledge where I come from and where I reside, and whose land I reside on. Because in Alaska, the biggest issue really in terms of voting is a racial issue and a disability rights issue. In our homeless population across the state, we see about 40% of people experiencing homelessness are Alaska Native people. It is a travesty that Alaska Native people experience homelessness in their state. And that is double, right? Over the entire population, Alaska Native people only represent 15% of the population. So that's more than double. And in terms of people with disabilities, we have about 18 to 20% of our state population are people living with disabilities. But in our homelessness population, it's like 40 to 50%, depending on the area. So we see this as a disability issue and a racial issue, primarily impacting Alaska Native people. We also changed our voter system in November from normal voting to ranked choice voting. Any changes to a voting system provide new anxieties and new challenges and new barriers to people. And primarily our outreach has been to homeless service providers, educating about how the ballots will look different, why we made the change to ranked choice voting, and then kind of step by step what that means in terms of the people that homeless service providers are working with. A little bit of history. Alaska was the first state in the United States to pass an anti-discrimination law. That happened in 1945. That was because of advocacy from the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood, which was formed in 1917 to create a political advocacy group centered around Native rights and Native interests. 1945, that's 20 years before there was a federal law, anti-discrimination law, and we were the first in the country, and that was because of Alaska Native advocacy. We also, this spring, our federal House of representative in the House of Representatives, we only have one because we have less than 1 million people, Don Young, passed away. He was our representative from 1973, I think, until 2022. So for most people's life, my entire life, people just filled in the oval of the person they thought would win. Because he passed away before his term ended, we were forced into a special election, and our education efforts had to kind of speed up and happen not over the summer, but in the spring and early summer. And so our outreach, our calendar changed drastically. What we saw in that special election was that rural voters' ballots where 1 out of 8 votes were tossed out. Why this is significant is in rural Alaska, which is cut off from the road system and is only accessible by small plane or by boat, are primarily Alaska Native people. And in terms of the homelessness issue, a lot of people will come to Anchorage, the largest city, to access medical services, to stay with more extended family, or for more opportunity in terms of employment and housing. Oftentimes those things they plan on when they're moving don't pan out, or they work for a little while, but not forever. And so we see these higher numbers in our homeless prevention and response system of people who've come from rural spaces. And in many places in Alaska, people's first language is not English. So in terms of accessing and understanding ballots, we have a lot of resources in Alaska Native languages. However, just navigating the world with English as a second language is a barrier to walking in and asking questions that somebody might have about how to vote. Federally, there are I think 574 federally recognized tribes. In Alaska, we have 239 of them. So more than half, or about half, of the federally recognized tribes exist in Alaska. I see some other people are doing ranked choice voting in their cities. The only other state that does it is Maine. However, in Utah, it's fairly common in primaries. Military voters often get to do ranked choice voting. But for a lot of people, it's totally new. And there's a lot of strategy amongst the candidates and how they're positioning themselves, because really you want to be that second person, or you want to get a lot of second place votes. So we have a new voting system. We have this documented disparity in kind of voter turnout, but we also have this amazing history of political mobilization within Indigenous groups in our state. And the coalition primarily has been reaching out through our continuum of care partners and our coalition members to educate them, because they have the primary relationships with the clients, and they see them every day or every week or a few times a year. And it's those relationships that we really want to lean on to get people registered and to vote. We also have some unique challenges when it comes to IDs presented at our voting places. In Alaska, you can use your hunting license, for instance. However, your tribal ID, which is a federal form of ID, is not accepted. This is a legal issue that we have been talking to our state legislature about for years, and it should be accepted. But a lot of people who work at polling places do not know what a tribal ID is, or why it. I agree with you, Tiffany. It's absolutely abhorrent. TSA also is mandated to accept tribal IDs, and so many TSA workers say, I've never seen this. This isn't a real ID. And why it's such a big issue in Alaska is because the number of federally recognized tribes and people for whom that might be their only form of ID. So those are kind of the challenges that are unique to our state and the ones that we've been educating people on. Like Rhode Island, we have a website on our coalition page that we've used. And we have also, like Rhode Island, been relying on partners in developing outreach materials. The nonprofit that tried to kind of move the ballot measure to institute ranked choice voting, Alaskans for Better Elections, produced a lot of videos, produced animations, and we shared those out. I think the biggest thing that we saw is that people experiencing homelessness aren't having computers, or are not having internet access, or can't charge their phones, and aren't kind of ready to fill out a lot of forms, and maybe even resistant to voting because of a history of kind of like not the candidates they wanted being elected. We have some awesome Alaska Native candidates this year, so we have an exciting lineup of people. And in the state legislature, we have 40 representatives and 20 senators, and 59 of those seats are up for election. And it's a governor's election for us. And it's all going to be ranked choice, at least in the governor's election and in our federal representatives and senators. And so we're going to see on a single ballot different ways of voting for different positions and a lot of options. So that's kind of the impetus behind why we took this on as a new thing for us to do as a coalition, and why it's so important to us. I want to leave some time for questions, because I think all of our states and groups presenting today have really different perspectives. Thank you so much, Courtney and Lindsay and everyone else who came today.
Thank you so much, Owen. We have, I would say, about 2 quick minutes for questions. So if our other panelists want to hop back on, you definitely can. And we've had a few back and forth in the Q&A, but want to make sure we uplift that for the full audience. So I'm going to combine 2 of these questions. Who is your target audience for voter engagement, and how do you reach those who don't have computer access? And I know some of you kind of touched upon each of these already.
I would say two things we're working on utilizing is the registration records. We're kind of doing a backwards look. We're looking and seeing all of for our target audience is low and moderate income renters in particular, and folks who are living in affordable housing developments. And we're coordinating with resident service coordinators and other property manager type frontline staff to particularly address the digital gap and make sure that those folks who are already part of the community itself have printable resources in multiple languages. But we're looking at voter registration records, and we're trying to help those resident service coordinators contrast that against their tenant lists and see who is and is not registered, maybe who's registered but doesn't always vote in every election or doesn't vote in a primary election. So it helps them be a little bit more targeted in who they're reaching out to and how and what kind of information that they might need. So like folks who voted by mail in the last election, you can get a list of those folks and say, hey, would you like to vote by mail again? It might be something that they thought was only possible during the pandemic. So those are just a couple of things that we're utilizing.
Great, thanks. And then one other question we got from Aaron in Florida. So here in Florida, we've witnessed a redistricting of legislative districts. Are we ensuring that voters are aware of the impact of redistricting?
Absolutely. I can't speak for all of Florida, but I think for us, it is clear that many of our elected officials who represented a specific district might represent more people, or their districts may have changed. And so it's important for folks to know that. Again, from our organization's perspective, if we're not talking about people's specific issue in this moment, people are not like with us. Midterms, I would say in Florida, we are, it's not feeling like there's an, how GOTV early voting started today in Miami-Dade County. You don't feel that urgency because people are stressed. People are busy. People are being evicted at alarming rates. They're trying to figure out all the things that are happening in this country. And so when we're having our organizing meetings, specifically to the question around our base, we're talking about people who we're building with in communities, and that's in person. And so I would not recommend us as folks who are trying to engage with community people have our stuff fully online. I think for us, we continue to learn the lesson around face-to-face, in-person gatherings, going to people's doors, showing up to community events has continued to be the best way to reach people. And it has to be specific to what they are naming as their specific issue. And it depends, I would say community by community. For the folks that we're talking about, it is conditions issues, it is rent affordability, and we're having clear questions around and answers around who has power right now, who can do something right now. These folks can. And so can we trust you to talk to your neighbors around the importance of voting this election cycle?
Thank you so much. I know that brings us to the end of our time. I do have a quick announcement I want to share. In respect for everyone's time, I will let our panelists log off if you have places to be. But if anyone has a minute to hear a quick announcement, I'm going to stay on because we actually have some information about partner organizations' grant funding. And a lot of people ask about grant funding, and I've promised to share information about that as it comes up. So here I am delivering on that promise. So National Voter Registration Day, which is one of the nonpartisan civic holidays taking place in the fall, has event grant opportunities for those who are signed up as National Voter Registration Day partners. It's not too late to sign up as a partner. And once you're signed up, you can apply for grant funding if you're planning on hosting an in-person, nonpartisan voter registration event on September 20th, 2022. The priority deadline is this Friday, August 12th, and the secondary deadline is on August 26th. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat, both to sign up as a partner if you haven't done so already, and the application to sign up and apply for the grant. And so you'll You can see more information about kind of what amounts of funding are available, what they can be used for on the application link, but I'm also happy to answer any questions about that if you can follow up with me by email. But I know we're a little bit over time here. Just want to thank all of our incredible panelists for a huge wealth of information and resources, and for all of the ongoing work that you're doing. And thank everyone for attending and just asking great questions and showing so much enthusiasm. Hope to see you 2 weeks from now. We'll have our next webinar on voting while experiencing homelessness.